Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pacific Region Forum on Business and Management Communication. I'm Rosalie Tung, Professor of International Business and Associate Director of the David Lamb Center for International Communication. This afternoon's forum will take the form of a dialogue, and what a better place to conduct this dialogue than at the lovely WASC Center for Dialogue. The theme for this afternoon's dialogue is a new concept of non-confrontational democracy. The speaker is Dr. Edward P.H. Wu and two commentators, Professor Earl Drake and Mr. James Ho. Dr. Wu was trained as a lawyer, was the co-founder of the Far East Stock Exchange in Hong Kong and the University of East Asia, now renamed as the University of Macau. Among his many other accomplishments, Dr. Wu has founded the Cyber Institute for the Research of Good Governance. Our first commentator is Professor Earl Drake, who has had a long distinguished career in the Canadian Foreign Services. He served in many positions, including as ambassador to China and ambassador to Indonesia. After his retirement from the Canadian Foreign Services in 1990, he joined the David Lamb Center. He is National Vice Chairman and BC Chapter Chairman of the Canada-China Business Council. Our second commentator is Dr. James Ho, who is founding director and former president of the Taiwan Entrepreneurs and Investors Association of Canada. He is also owner of Mainstream Broadcasting Corporation, multi-vision television station, and investment company with significant interest and experience in Greater China. I'll turn to Dr. Wu.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Simon Fraser University and Professor Jan Voss for making arrangement for me to talk about a topic which I believe is very crucial and very timely, considering the conflicts and turmoil the world is facing in recent years. The subject matter of our discussion today is a new concept of non-confrontational democracy. The discussion is subdivided into 7 separate headings, as shown on the screen. Democracy is undoubtedly the most talked about topic in modern politics. What is democracy? Practically every government claims that it practices democracy. Politicians in different jurisdictions may attach a different meaning to this term. There are endless arguments. To the man in the street, the word is loosely used as a synonym for good governance. In my view, to understand the problems of the world, we must be very specific. Democracy is a form or a system of government where the interests and the wishes of the people are held to be of first and paramount importance, and where the people have the final say in the form and function of the government. It is the system of government referred to as one of the people, for the people, and by the people. Perhaps democracy could also be looked upon as a philosophy of governance, aiming at achieving certain objectives. These objectives are referred to as the ideals of democracy. The method used in bringing about democratic ideals must not be confused with the ideals themselves. Liberty and freedom are ideals of democracy. The ideals of democracy consist mainly of the granting of a host of rights and freedom to the people. They also include rule of law, transparency, cleanliness, and checks and balances in any administration. The desirability of these ideals is never in doubt. Although our discussion today will not focus on the ideals of democracy, at the end of my talk, I will still come back to share some of my thoughts on how different cultures influence our thinking about these ideals. Very swiftly, we move on to the next topic. What is the best way to implement democracy according to the traditional way of thinking? Many people feel, and no doubt they are correct, that the only way to bring about democratic ideals is to make sure that there will be a free, fair, and open election once every few years, to decide which political party will be conferred the right to form the government. But if the understanding of democracy, as I have just outlined, is accepted, then the system of multi-party elections presently adopted is only one of the ways of implementing democracy. For convenience sake, I refer to the system of multi-party elections as the MPE system. A crucial point I must emphasize is that the means must not be confused with the end. The MPE system is the means, and the ideals of democracy are the end. Many political thinkers believe that because there are elections to be held at regular intervals, there is hope for change. Because of this hope, even if the people were not satisfied with the performance of the government, their grievances would not explode into a revolution. They would show their dissatisfaction through the ballot box in the next election. The election system, it is said, provides for a safety valve. There is certainly logic in this analysis. There is another important argument for MPE. Because there is an opposition party, there are checks and balances within a government. Checks and balances are invaluable. Indeed, they are so important that, as you will hear, the new model I am about to introduce places special emphasis on this aspect of governance. We now move on to the next topic. Is there anything wrong with the MPE system? I say there is. I shall explain why. Quite apart from the fact that the MPE system would induce conflict at an institutional level, we know that anyone elected into office would hope to retain power in the next election. With the machinery of government under his control, a person in power is tempted to do whatever he can to see to it that his opponent has no chance in the next election. The likelihood, especially in underdeveloped countries, is that a newly installed government would use whatever means, often unscrupulous, to achieve this. This phenomenon is so common that there is hardly any need to give examples to prove the point. The issue whether a system can bring about democratic ideals depends not so much on the fact whether or not there is a mechanism to elect the head of government in the country. We all know that there was a system of democratic election in Italy and Germany before Mussolini and Hitler came into power, and yet the system plunged into outright dictatorship. The core of the problem, it seems, is whether a leader could hope, under some pretext, to continue to stay in power. If this problem is not resolved, what we saw in Italy and Germany could be repeated anywhere. Indeed, it seems that that was exactly what happened with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We are not so sure if the same thing is not again taking place somewhere in Africa. The desire to hang on to power is part of human nature. It can be looked upon as a form of human weakness, which exists throughout history. It is unrealistic to hope that this weakness will suddenly disappear. The only thing we could do is to improve on our political systems to prevent the making of dictators, and thereby minimize the sufferings of the common people. This is why it is so important that the MPE system has to be modified. To sum up the shortcomings of the MPE system in one sentence, I would say that the system is bad because although elections are arranged as an event to take place once every few years. There is always a risk of conflict between the different factions within a country before the event, and the danger of making a dictator after the event. Rwanda is a good example of the former case, and Saddam Hussein is a typical example of the latter. These shortcomings can be compared with the side effects of medication. I hold the view that unless we can bring this side effect under control, the MPE system creates a danger of steering the people in many territories into disastrous confrontation. We have now reached the core of our discussion today. What is the remedy? What can we do to improve on the MPE system? A new concept of non-confrontational democracy is what I would like to introduce. How can we do it? In the first place, we should analyze the functions of a government. A government discharges two duties. One, it chooses the policies, and two, it handles the day-to-day administration. The two functions are separate and distinct. Concerning the first part, that is, the policies, we must bear in mind that any administration owes a duty to respect the views of the people. The policies they want ought to be reflected in the legislation to be enacted from time to time. Accordingly, the first recommendation is that a government should have a mission statement setting out its priorities in specific terms. The reason for making this point is that some issues might not be a matter of concern in the past, but owing to a change of circumstances, the same issues might become a matter of top priority today. A typical example is the need to deal with terrorism. We must not give in to terrorism, but without being hesitant to fight it. We must not allow a major reason for terrorism, namely hatred, to brew. The issue, therefore, is how can we solve the problem of terrorism, and not simply what could we do to bring those responsible for the acts of terrorism to justice. This is an example of the flexibility and the thoughtfulness we must possess when we refer the issues to the public in a referendum. Finding out the wish of the people is a rather laborious process. It would be quite impractical in the past. The advancement in communication technology has made it possible. Great care must be taken to frame the issues. They should be done in such a way that it will promote peace, stability, and harmony. The questions should include, for example, as I have just said, what is the proper way to solve the problem of terrorism? What exactly is the role of religions in politics? Should there be true freedom of religious beliefs? Is it proper for the followers of one religion to look down upon those of another? Should there be racial discrimination among the citizens of the country? What should be done to foster better relationship between different races within the country? Whether the country should stay in an environment free of weapons of mass destruction, and whether the country should adopt a hostile or a friendly stance with a neighboring government. All these are important issues, and they are above party politics. A proper analysis of these issues will go a long way towards solving the conflicts of the world. We can expect to receive rational answers if, and only if, the questions are impartially framed. When a conflict of interest exists, such as the need to hold multi-party elections, the issues might become distorted, and both the questions and answers might become unpredictable, for so much depends on the motive or the ulterior motive of the persons framing the issues. On this account, I advocate that important policies must not only reflect the wish of the people, they should be decided upon prior to the choice of a team to form the government, so that whosoever taking on the task of administration must follow them. This is the first step. The next step, which is another important aspect of the improvement package, is to provide for a new method of choosing a team to form the government. Elections will be held. There is no limit to the number of political parties joining in the contest. Through a system of fair, free, and open election, the two most favored parties will be included in a short list. Steps will then be taken to ensure that they become equally acceptable to the people. There are many ways to achieve this. A very effective way is to strengthen the makeup of the would-be cabinet. Having achieved this target of similarity in terms of acceptance, a system of lottery would be used. One of these two parties will be conferred the right or responsibility to form the government for a limited duration, and the other party will take up the role as supervisors of the government during the same period. Their respective roles must be clearly defined. The party supervising the government is not looked upon as an opposition party. It has a duty and a responsibility to supervise and to assist the party in office, and it must do so under some clear and well-defined guidelines. With this change in concept, checks and balances are truly incorporated into the system. The diagram shown on the top of the screen is a flow chart of a conventional government using the MPE system. Here, we have the people electing their representatives to form the government. The government looks after two aspects of governance, namely policy and administration. The diagram at the bottom describes the new model. It shows the policy and the administration are being dealt with separately. Here, we see the people decide on the policies. The two most popular parties, symbolized by a black ball and a white ball, will accept the result of a lottery. As the result of a lottery depends on chance, you might ask, isn't it unfair for a party winning an election to face the risk of having to hand over the right of administration to the first runner-up? The short answer is, we must remind ourselves that the ultimate aim of a political party, as well as any person involved with politics, is to render service to the country, not to defeat his opponents. One can say that holding a public office is a responsibility as much as a right. Based on this analysis, there is no reason to complain. Then, as soon as some of us hear the word lottery, they cannot help drawing the conclusion that the whole idea is precarious. They cannot accept the uncertainty. Is their concern justified? Were it not for the fact that a round of election had already been held, so that the basic minimum test was already satisfied, lottery might indeed be precarious. This is not the situation here. If both of the parties in the short list are equally qualified and equally acceptable to the people, our aim is to do exactly that. When equality is achieved, there is no harm done having either one of them On the issue whether the uncertainty is objectionable, let us look at life. There is no certainty that we are going to live to a ripe old age, or indeed for any length of time. The uncertainty has shaped our conduct, making us behave the way we do. It is the uncertainty that induces us to care for others and to be creative in preparing for the future. It is the uncertainty that makes life interesting. With the existing MPE system, the certainty is that if you have the most votes, you will stay in power. There are more ways than one to have the most votes. There is the one legitimate way, and the 101 other ways which are not so legitimate. I'm sure that given the choice, the people living in any country in trouble would prefer to have the uncertainty between two equally qualified candidates, rather than the certainty of an unavoidable risk of power struggle or a dictator in the making. So, instead of having an election once every few years to choose one winner and eliminate the rest, we shall carry out elections. Choose the two most favored parties, make some adjustments to ensure parity insofar as acceptability is concerned, and then lots will be drawn to decide on the role of these two parties. The same process shall be repeated once every few years. The reason why it is recommended that the two steps should be taken is quite simple. The first step will ensure that the policies followed by the government are in accordance with the wish of the people, without the influence of party politics. In this manner, democratic values are truly upheld. The second step will eliminate any motive for confrontation. In removing the need to fight for supremacy, a major reason for power struggle is also removed. Another important point some members of the audience might want to raise is the ideals of political parties. Based on the traditional understanding, each political party has its own ideals and agenda. The divergence of ideals create the distinguishing features between political parties. How then could we expect them upholding different views to cooperate? Pluralism in ideas about what is best for a country is of course to be encouraged. But there is no need for anyone, especially the ruling party, to insist upon any political ideology. Interaction with the people, and finally, submitting to their wish, is the preferred attitude. And this is much more meaningful than to be arbitrary. A submission to reality is nothing more than taking a pragmatic approach. I think China has proven beyond doubt how important it is to take a pragmatic approach. She had chosen to be pragmatic rather than to insist upon the old dogmatic principle of a planned economy and the prohibition of private ownership. We now move on to the next topic, the advantages in adopting this new model. I want to emphasize that I do not for one moment make any attempt to compromise the ideals of democracy. I can see that the new model has three advantages. First, it ensures that while upholding democratic values, power struggle is avoided, minimizing the chance of using religion and/or racism as an excuse for animosity. Dissolving hostility and hatred is important, and I would say inevitable, in dealing with the problem of terrorism. Secondly, as the reason for conflict disappears, so does party jealousy. There will not be an opposition party as such. The two most favored parties will be delegated the task of either administration or supervision. Human resources will not be wasted. Checks and balances are truly incorporated into this new system of government. And thirdly, the new model will remove a major reason for those in power to commit serious abuses of human rights. This is very important. Let us make no mistake about it. Why does a ruler commit abuses of human rights? Surely, it is not because he is sadistic by nature. More often than not, it is because a dictator wants to stay in power and have his way of doing things. He might deliberately choose to project an image of brutality to scare off opposition. If the system would not allow a strong man to eliminate his opponent, then any repressive measures he might think of using would serve no useful purpose. As in the case of murder, once the motive is removed, there is no longer a reason to commit the crime. The proposed new model is therefore possibly the best safeguard against large-scale, serious abuses of human rights. Turning to the next topic, the practical application of the new model. A political theory cannot possibly gain acceptance unless it is practical. The suggested model is meaningless unless we can apply it to real life. We examine its practical value by looking at the following three aspects. First, we see if we can identify some territories which could benefit from using the new system. We all agree that the world is very chaotic. The people in many territories have suffered immensely as a result of power struggle. The list of nations on the verge of civil war because of power struggle is getting longer by the day. Many people believe that the introduction of multi-party election is the answer. I urge the powerful think tanks to look at the real cause of the problem, because the exact opposite seems to be the case in underdeveloped countries, typically those in Africa. Take the case of Rwanda. The two different ethnic groupings, namely the Tutsi and the Tutsi, living in that country, had no history of conflict before Rwanda's independence. After the Belgian colonialists left, MPE was introduced. Violence erupted, and over 800,000 people were killed within a span of 100 days. We are taught that it is good to have free, fair, and open elections. But we need to be reminded that there must also be peace and stability in any society. The suggested model could have both. We can apply it rather conveniently to the underdeveloped territories, and in particular, the hot spots around the world. I have singled out Chechnya to do a case study. Chechnya is a province within the Russian Federation, having a population of 1.2 million. There are roughly 1 million Muslims and about 200,000 Orthodox Christians. If we use the conventional MPE system, there is a likelihood that the result would fall along the line of ethnic and religious division. If that should happen, sooner or later, it is very likely that there will be demand for the separation of Chechnya from the rest of Russia. The politicians in the Russian parliament cannot appear to favor this scenario, yet they could not find an excuse for not holding multi-party elections in Chechnya. No solution seems to be in sight. The new system could satisfy both the Russian parliament and the local people in Chechnya. The beauty of the system is that the more complex a society is, in terms of ethnic and religious division, the more appeal there is for using it. This is the logic. What the people want in Chechnya is surely stability and a reasonably affluent society. It is beyond challenge that in the modern world, no one can rightfully claim ethnic superiority or religious discrimination. Neither the people in Chechnya, who are predominantly Muslims, nor the people in Russia, who are predominantly Orthodox Christians, can insist upon a policy of discrimination. When a territory is truly free of discrimination, as I hope the first step in my new model will spell it out, then it does not make that much difference who is to be appointed to carry out the administration. Based on this analysis, I hope that the authority in Russia, as well as all the parties concerned, will seriously consider whether the recommended model, simple as it is, could help to bring about a breakthrough. The reason why I have singled out Chechnya as an example to explain how the model can work is simply this. Even if the model works, as I believe it does, one cannot expect it to change the long-established system around the world in one go. If a new system is useful in bringing peace and harmony to the world, let us hope that it can start from somewhere. The complications in Chechnya make the new model look extremely appealing, and Chechnya is urgently in need of a solution. Needless to say, we can apply it also to the other areas in trouble. Then, we must find out who is the appropriate personality to promote the system. Any political party which has to stand for election cannot agree to a lottery. To do so will be looked upon as a sign of weakness, or at least not having confidence in the next election. The most appropriate party to introduce the system is probably an authoritarian ruler on his retirement. Marcos could have introduced the system in the Philippines and Suharto in Indonesia. Even Castro of Cuba, the ruling junta in Myanmar, and Kim of North Korea could introduce the new system to their respective country. Anyone who did so would have a place in the history of democratic development. How convenient it would have been for the British colonial government to insist upon the adoption of this new model when it decided to put an end to its colonial rule. If it did so, history would have taken a different course in many places, such as the Middle East, including Afghanistan, Iran and Iraq, in India and Pakistan, in Burma, etc., etc. Perhaps much of the bloodshed in these territories since their independence could have been avoided. Today, the British-American coalition in Iraq is in a position similar to the final days of the British colonial administration. It has to leave the administration to the local people. Hopefully, it will leave behind a political structure which will ensure peace and stability, not an arena for power struggle between the different factions, such as the Shia and the Sunnis in that country. Finally, we examine the steps that have to be taken to modify the MPE system. The steps to be taken are by no means complicated. If the authorities in Russia or the British-American coalition is interested in the idea proposed, it could appoint a special commission to study the pros and cons. If considered feasible, appropriate legislation will have to be introduced. Since the move is for the benefit of all concerned, and considering the fact that there is no downside risk, While the possibility of solving the problem is real, I am not at all surprised that the idea will receive widespread support once we make a real effort to understand it. The obstacle to the system. For general acceptance of this new model by the global community, there are certainly many hurdles to overcome. In my opinion, the most difficult hurdle has relatively little to do with the merit of the proposal itself. The most difficult part is for the people to understand the true meaning of democracy and to appreciate the difference between democratic ideals and the means to bring about such ideals. Many people, especially academics, are adamant that democracy requires the holding of multi-party elections conducted in the way they are presently done. It never occurs to them that there could be a need for change. They are skeptical of any system other than the present one-man, one-vote system in selecting a winner and eliminating all other competitors. Still, they have to admit that although the MPE system works out fine in the USA and in some developed countries, it is facing severe challenge in Africa and in underdeveloped territories. When a system fails to work, we could either put the blame on the system itself or on the people or some extrinsic circumstances. Those who promote the MPR system, the MPE system, like to put the blame on the people. They claim that poverty and illiteracy have a direct link with the failure in the implementation of democracy. There may be some truth, but obviously they are not the only cause of failure. I submit it is high time that we take a serious look and see if there is anything wrong with the system itself. Based upon an analysis of the conflicts in the many hotspots around the world, I suggest that there are 4 basic ingredients for conflicts in any territories. They are: 1. Racial and ethnic difference in a community. 2. Religious diversity, especially if religion is allowed to play an unknown part in politics. 3. Poverty. And 4, the need to hold multi-party elections. No doubt, as I have said, up to this moment, multi-party elections have worked out splendidly in the USA and in some developed countries. I believe the system has not encountered problem there, mainly because some of the above-mentioned ingredients are not present. Upon the emergence of all these ingredients, a possibility we cannot rule out in the years to come, the people in these countries might suddenly find themselves engulfed in conflicts. The purpose of my endeavors is to introduce new ideas, to improve on the existing system to bring about democratic ideals. It is hoped that these ideas will reach the ears of policymakers in those countries desperately in need of finding a solution to bring peace to their community. I have merely laid down certain broad, basic principles which are obvious to me. I hope that the academics and practitioners will find time to conduct a much more thorough research on the subject. This concludes my discussion on the subject matter, a new concept of non-confrontation democracy. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned about the fact that different cultures would influence the way we look at the ideals of democracy. I also said that we all cherish such ideals. If we all cherish such ideals, one may ask, why do governments take a different stand when they handle the same situation? Is there such a thing as Asian value? To go into these issues, we must understand about a difference in culture between the East and the West. Chinese culture was, to a large extent, developed from scholastic ideology, that is, 儒家思想. This ideology has a far-reaching influence on the way Chinese people think and behave. I would like to summarize the essence of scholastic ideology in just a few words. We can use 8 Chinese characters to demonstrate the main theme of scholastic ideology. They are 孝悌忠顺, 礼义廉耻. They are known as the 8 virtues. So these 8 words, as explained on the screen, present a summary of what is expected of a respectable person brought up in the Chinese society. If one had to pick up just one word to describe the essence, that one word is surely a sense of responsibility. What about Western culture? What is the essence of American culture? It must be equality, liberty, and freedom. If we have to choose one word to describe American culture, that one word is the rights of individual. So, at the end of the day, what have we got? We have rights on the one hand and responsibility on the other. Let us see how these differences in culture influence the way we handle social incidents like protests and street demonstrations. We cannot deny that human beings must have a right to voice their protests against grievances. But we also agree that protests in the form of street demonstrations, as well as industrial actions in essential services, might result in a disruption and inconvenience to the daily life of other members of the community. It might spark off disorder and disturbances in society. When our thinking focuses on the rights of individuals, we tend to ignore these other consequences. Being a member of the society or an employee of an organization, we owe a duty to be loyal to it. We have a responsibility to contribute our share to ensure that the society we live in or the organization to which we belong is not jeopardized by our conduct. To analyze the moral justification for street demonstrations as well as industrial action, we should ask ourselves one question: which is more important, the rights of the individual or his responsibility to be loyal to the society or the organization to which he belongs? The answer cannot be one-sided. We must strike a proper balance. This line of thinking is consistent with a theory which is considered extremely important and highly valued in Chinese culture, known as 中庸之道, translated as the philosophy of the golden means between extremities, or the philosophy of moderation. So, having said all these, what is the conclusion? We do understand that there is a difference in culture between the East and the West. We have to respect this difference, even though it may lead us towards a clash of civilization. But there is no need to feel agitated. 中庸之道 will help us to find a solution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wu. Our first respondent is Professor Earl Drake.
Thank you. Before I begin my critique, I would like to make a disclaimer. I'm not completely neutral and detached in approaching this subject. For several years, I have known Edward Wu and admired his fertile mind and imagination, his public-spirited willingness to devote a lot of time to wrestling with problems facing modern society, and his ability to blend together positive elements from both the classical Chinese and modern Western cultures that have nurtured him all his life. I applaud his audacity as a novice in political science in challenging conventional wisdom about democracy. And I admit to having encouraged him to keep thinking and writing about the differences and similarities in Chinese and Western approaches to governance issues. Thus, I salute him for making us re-examine some of our traditional assumptions and political practices. But that does not mean that I agree with all the points in his paper. Let me recount briefly my criticisms, first in terms of theory, and then on the question of where to apply his model as a practical test. I have 5 criticisms. Mr. Wu asserts that the record of Hitler, Mussolini, and Saddam Hussein in seizing and keeping power under a democratic constitution demonstrates that a multi-party election system creates a danger of conflict before the event and a danger of dictatorship after the event. On the contrary, I think the history of those 3 countries simply shows that in a society where the democratic tradition is weak, the rule of law virtually unknown, and the social and economic conditions unstable, it is possible for an unscrupulous demagogue to win once at the polls and then retain power through guile and force. On the other hand, the modern history of the English-speaking world demonstrates that a multi-party election system promotes democracy, social and economic progress, the mitigation of internal conflict, and the absence of dictatorship. I submit that the different results in the 2 cases do not stem from the nature of the election rules, but from the much longer record of respect for democracy, individual rights, and rule of law, plus a high level of prosperity and stability in the English-speaking world than in the Germany and Italy of the 1930s and in modern Iraq. Secondly, the heart of this paper is the proposal to improve the MPE system by, I'm just repeating what Mr. Wu has said, by asking the people directly by modern communications technology to decide on important issues above party politics, like the role of religion and racial discrimination in the state, and hostility or peace with its neighbors. First part. And the second part, after determining the 2 most favored political parties by election, one party will be chosen by lot to form the government, and the other party to supervise the government for a limited term of years, but not to consider itself the opposition party. Now, Mr. Wu argues that because their ultimate aim is to render service to the country, all political parties should accept this system that will ensure that the wishes of the people will prevail over party politics, and that hostility and hatred will dissolve throughout the country. I admire his lofty philosophical tone in making these recommendations. It is somewhat reminiscent of Socrates and Plato describing the ideal society, if only they could find perfectly rational and unselfish philosopher-patriots to preside over it. I am touched that Mr. Wu is so high-minded as to think that modern political parties are totally selfless and civic-minded. But I have to disillusion him by saying, not any of the politicians I've met, and I've met a lot, they do believe they are serving the public good, most of them do believe that, but they also think that they have a monopoly on the best ideas. They want to stay in power as long as possible, and they often enjoy humiliating their opponents. They are not all selfless and would not like the Wu system that threatens their hold on power. That's just a reality of the nature of politicians and their quest for power. Third, There are other reasons for finding his proposal unworkable in our democratic society. I like the idea of putting important questions to the people, but who would decide which are the important questions to be decided by the people? Who would draft these questions to be sure that they were totally neutral and objective? These are vital and critical questions, as all Canadians learned not very long ago when the government of Quebec drafted a referendum on sovereignty. It was so complicated and so confusing that many voters were unclear what they were voting for, and yet the results were dramatic. The results would have been catastrophic. Thus, a partisan provincial government was allowed to draft a deliberately obfuscated question of great importance to the whole country because the rules were unclear as to who could propose a referendum and under what guidelines. Since then, the federal government of Canada has passed the Controversial Clarity Act, which defines what sort of language and voting margin would be acceptable on any referendum on sovereignty. Mr. Wu's paper stresses the importance of basic questions being decided directly by the people rather than by the legislature. But, judging by the Canadian experience, it is not nearly so simple a matter as he suggests. 4. This brings me to another gap in Mr. Wu's plan, in my mind. The absence of any defined role for a Supreme Court. In the Canadian case again, the role of the Supreme Court was critical in the Quebec case. Most constitutional proposals anywhere in the world define the role and powers of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government, and how each is chosen. Mr. Wu was silent on the judicial branch, which would seem to be particularly important in a scheme where we are worried about the absence of traditional checks and balances. 5th, Mr. Wu tells us what would happen to the two top parties. But what would happen to the other parties? Would they have no role at all? Traditional Democrats in North America, and particularly in Europe, would be disturbed to find that under his system, their views would not be reflected at all in the legislature or in the government if they voted for a party that came in number 3 or number 4. Traditionally in Canada, we have more than two parties. Thus, my frank assessment is that this non-confrontational democracy proposal is unlikely to be adopted anywhere in the Western world, where most people are reasonably satisfied with the existing system, despite some grumbling about how poorly it works in practice, as we know in Canada today. Nor do I see any chance that Eastern European, Middle Eastern, or African governments that have known only dictatorships or watered-down democracy would suddenly opt for such an untried and idealistic experiment in governance. These countries might well benefit from Mr. Wu's plan if it were implemented. Yes, I think it might be a splendid thing, but I cannot see any of their leaders accepting such a radical experiment that would threaten their power. And he says the choice would have to be made by some autocratic leader who was about to retire. It would threaten their power or the power of their colleagues or their family. They, in my view, they are too insecure and venal to try such a plan simply because, quote, it might be for the good of the country, unquote. So those are my theoretical criticisms, but let's turn to the practical problem. Where could the new model be applied? Mr. Wu proposes Chechnya. Once again, I admire him for this suggestion. This is a part of the world that desperately needs fresh thinking by outsiders with no vested interest in the outcome. If it would help the situation in Chechnya, the world would applaud. But frankly, I doubt that it has any chance of being considered by either the Chechnyans or the Russians. This is a brutal struggle for raw power, fueled by age-old ethnic and religious hatreds and betrayals. There is no mutual trust. no pretense of searching for ideal constitutions. The Chechen struggle on both sides is characterized by the use of force, terrorism, and repression to gain absolute power for each side against its traditional enemy, not shared power, and not by a search for a non-confrontational democracy. However, after being gloomy and saying all the things that I found difficult about the paper, I do think that this concept might stir interest in one important part of the world, and that is China. There are several reasons for saying this. First, Mr. Wu's argumentation today, but particularly in his book from which today's paper is derived, draws heavily on Chinese scholastic ideology. This would strike a responsive chord in Chinese intellectual circles even today. Secondly, although China appears to many people in the Western world to be an oppressive, autocratic, one-party state, its domestic defenders claim that it has its own form of democracy, and they are open to reform. The new government of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao seems open to some modest experimentation with new forms of democracy at the local level. Some of China's think tanks are surprisingly open to discussions about new approaches to democracy. So the time seems ripe. China is also, it's largely united, peaceful, and prosperous, unlike some of the other countries cited by Mr. Wu that are racked by fierce religious and ethnic tension and violent struggle. In my view, China presents a good climate for constitutional experimentation because it is self-confident after 25 years of steady economic reform and is now ready for some modest political reform. China has a tradition of trying politico-economic experiments in a few cities and digesting the results before introducing them nationally. For example, they had special economic zones and then model environmental cities. It's a long tradition of doing this. One of the most interesting experiments has just begun in Shenzhen, next door to Mr. Wu's home city of Hong Kong, or one of his two home cities. It introduces a local variant on the Western political doctrine of the separation of powers, which is similar to one aspect of Mr. Wu's proposal. This involves limiting the power of the Communist Party to, quote, drawing up the overall economic development strategy for an area and setting some other important policies, unquote, but forbidding it to get involved in the executive, legislative, and judicial work of government. The aim of the Shenzhen experiment is to break up government power and trifurcate it into a decision-making mechanism, an enforcement mechanism, and a supervisory mechanism. It does not allow new political parties to be formed or senior officials to be directly elected. The mayor of Shenzhen claims that his city is, quote, the new pilot of limited political reform and will be the first in China to build a government to be administered by the rule of law, being democratic and transparent in governance, being efficient and high quality, fair and clean in 3 to 5 years. Now, I do not want to dwell on the details of the Shenzhen experiment because it's a far cry from Edward Wu's idealistic concept of non-confrontational democracy. However, I do urge Mr. Wu to study and be encouraged by Shenzhen because it shows that China is open to limited experiment and innovation with new, untried forms of government. Coincident with the Shenzhen experiment, a new think tank on political reform has been established at the Central Party School in Beijing under the auspices of Zhang Qinghong, a powerful member of the Politburo. Both these events convince me that China is now ripe for some modest political reform and that it would be timely for Mr. Wu to engage leading Chinese leaders and intellectuals in discussion about how his ideas might be adapted to the needs of a changing China. In conclusion, I do not think Mr. Wu's total concept will find much favor in the Americas or in Europe. But some of his ideas might be considered timely and relevant in China. In short, I think his concept would be admirable if the world were run by selfless patriots, but I don't think that's true. It is unlikely to find favor in most of the modern world, where there's little support for sweeping change in the political systems, but might possibly attract the interest of Chinese leaders who are actively considering political reform experiments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Drake. Our second respondent is Mr. James Ho.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Drake, Dr. Wu. Actually, being the second person to Dr. Drake, this is probably our third time together.
Yeah, that's right.
I've always asked Dr. Drake to speak first. Actually, in lots of points that Dr. Drake has covered has covered a lot of my thinking along the line as well. Having read the book by Dr. Edward Wu, by the way, they are available outside. It's an excellent book in terms of dissecting and showing the differences between the Western culture and the Chinese culture. It's really a very detailed work that Dr. Wu has done, and that's really has also given me different type of perspective in both my own personal life's point of view as well as my political point of view. Having read the book and listened to Dr. Wu's paper here, it is, what I find is basically it is a very idealistic way of governing a new theory. And like everything else in life, it started with all these good intentions and selflessness, very wide, very idealistic way of thinking, and then of course it develops from there, like everything else. However, there are many challenges, and the area of challenges are quite simple in my mind. Like Dr. Drake have mentioned about the nature of these politicians. What it boils down to is basically two things: the human natures and survival instinct. You're right. I've never seen politicians being courteous to others, especially their opposition. As a matter of fact, they constantly challenge them and taking shots at them, which is, I guess, human nature in this situation. That having covered by Dr. Drake, I will not go into a whole lot into that situation, but something that's occurred to me over and over again is this religion beliefs. What I look at the religion, which we were governed by this different religion for many thousands of years. Actually, the religion was used as the law to govern the people before the law, and before there was law. Given a very simple example, the Buddhism. Being a young person growing up, I remember the family always said that, the mother always says that behave yourself, otherwise you will be sent to hell. So I have to behave yourself, because in my old beliefs, when I was growing up, I didn't know what is law, what is not law, but I know going to hell is going to be a very painful experience, so I have to behave myself. And that's been practiced over and over again. And over the period of time, even though we're all humans in this world, it developed into many different religions, just like the Western world and the Far East. So with this deep belief in the religion, it is, in the practical sense, it's very difficult to separate the religious belief and the political belief. They're always going to be together. They're always going to be linked together. The example that Dr. Wu given about Chechnya, being 1.2 million people, about 1 million of them being the Muslim, and 200,000 being being the Christian. If it comes to voting, if this has to be put to the situation where everybody have to vote, obviously the religious belief is going to play a big part of it in the situation here. However, there's another example that I've personally experienced about 10 years ago when I traveled down to Central and South America. I want to give an example of Costa Rica. It's one of the most stable country in Central and South America. It's one of the most desirable place for people to live. I was there a couple times, and during one time it was very interesting because it was election time. It's not that because I want to observe the election, I was there to do business. I happened to bump into the election time. And of course, there are two-sided party, as always, trying to become elected. And to my findings was always, it was interesting to find out that the people actually will not vote the same party twice. It was actually by the choice of people. They have no military. They abolished the military because of the hardship they have been through during the past. So the people has actually been conditioned they will never elect the same party twice. So no party in hope and hell will ever be elected twice in a row. They always change party every 4 years. And that also come to a very interesting situation because towards the end, people know who's going to be elected. So the people or the party that's actually in power has no power. The party has yet to be in power was the most powerful party there is because everybody jumps to their party and talk to them, whatever the situation. That's basically the human nature. And recently we have seen another example in the Canadian politics, even though it's liberal to liberal, but we have seen how many people jump ship when Chrétien said that he's not going to be in power, and Paul Martin's going to be in power. Of all the politicians that I knew, a lot of them were loyal to Chrétien, become loyal to Martin, even though Chrétien was still in power at the time. There's absolutely very little courtesy given to Chrétien. Again, unfortunately, that's politician, and that's their nature, and that's our human nature again. So having said this, I want to talk about the two parties being the last two favored party that's being in power. In the ideal situation, perhaps one have slightly more vote than the other, but in reality, things can always happen the other way. If we have ended up with two parties, and one is going to be in power for the years they're going to be in, and then the other party will automatically be in power after. Take example here in our provincial government, NDP versus Liberal. Out of 74 seats, Liberal has about 72. NDP has 2. And these are the only two parties that we have at this moment. How do we do things if that happens? That's another challenge, the area where we have to overcome as well. And of course, the determination of the duration in power, how long is ideal? Now, all these things that one have to think about and talk about as to how do we resolve these things. And during the course of resolving it, we also have to find a peaceful way of resolving the differences. And lastly, of course, hearing Dr. Wu's speech as well as Dr. Drake, I'm in agreement here with both of you in terms of the growing area. This theory actually could be part of the growth, could be part of the growing pain that China is going through, because no matter what that we look at China, it has came a long way from the 1940s, 50s, or 60s, or even 70s till today. that everybody agree it is a country that is opening up. It is start to recognize the right of human being more so than before, and the policy, whatever that we looked at, whether it's economic policy or has to do with the political policy, that is changing all the time. And I bet you if you ask any politicians or any scholars what they know today and compared to what they knew about a year ago, their knowledge, their observation has vastly changed their view over the period of time. And I think this theory perhaps is also best suitable for mainland China, because mainland China does not allow MPE, multi-party elections. There really is no election, like you were saying, towards the senior officials, but it is starting with the countryside, the counties. They actually allowed elections. They allow people to have a free will express of who they want to elect, which in that situation that will affect their life the most because of the places they live. And that is a single party election of the people, of the different people within the party. Perhaps, like I say, that people or the government in China can take a look at this paper with a very interesting theory or experimental area within it. Of course, I do not think that one should take the whole thing and just re-implement it into their own existing policy. Of course, there's going to be quite a bit of modifications to it. But like I say, it is a very interesting piece of paper that Dr. Edward Wood has written. And in its value, like I say, its basic value has been coming out being very fair, very selfishness, and selflessness, I mean. And perhaps it can be adopted to a certain part of the world and not the rest of the world. It is something that we are seeing here, and I will encourage more research to be done because it is really an eye-opener for me as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ho. We'll now open the forum up to questions from the audience. How much time do we have, Jen, until?
I think we can go on for another 15, 20 minutes or so.
Okay. Yes.
Governments today tend to be franchisees, and they function more as franchisees for industry rather than for the people. And the power of the industry really lobbies and harnesses the MPE systems to manage government for its own goods. And a part of the industry of that, I don't really think religion is the cause of terrorism. Or does the industry of terrorism inscript religions to incite terror, to keep the economics of terror alive, and where the real directors of terrorism would be terrorists, drug lords, and arms dealers. So it's the industries of terrorism, the big multi-international industries are the ones that really control government. Looking at this, and the MPE system itself, we've outgrown it. Humanity has outgrown it. It was good and useful at its earlier stages. Life has become too complex. And trying to take the MPE system and move it around within the box and rearrange it and revise it in the box isn't going to be the answer. You have to go outside the box to find the answer, because that's not the problem. I don't think so.
It is very interesting that you mention about the MPE system being overgrown. Political systems are made by human beings, and what is suitable at one time may turn out to be totally unsuitable at a different time. For example, I just want to give you an example. Absolute monarchy had been the system for thousands of years, on the basis that the fittest will survive. The very fact that absolute monarchies survive for 5,000 years means that it was suitable at the time. But why was it suitable at that time and no longer suitable today? Because, as I've written and I've mentioned in my book, see, the absolute monarchy would eliminate any opposition that comes his way. He would brutally kill the inhabitants of a village if they oppose his policies. But then it was possible at the time. With the growth in the size of population, it is no longer possible for any monarchy, any dictator to kill everybody. So they have to listen to the views of the people. Not that they have changed their mind, not that they have improved insofar as their mentality is concerned. So I agree with you that something good at one time is not necessarily good at another time. You mentioned about the industry, the entrepreneurs, the huge international corporation controlling the government. Well, to a certain extent they are, but every one of us also control the government. It's all a matter of degree. Thank you.
From this gentleman at the back.
Hello, my name is Roderick Lewis. I'm just first off would like to say thank you very much to SFU and to yourself, Dr. Wu, and other panel participants for putting this afternoon on. It's been always very good to have important issues such as how people's voices are heard, discussed in a diplomatic venue such as this. I head up a little organization that was founded to ensure, or to work to ensure, that adults with disabilities have their opinions, if they so choose, involved in policy setting. So this is kind of a macro setting of that. To get to my question regarding your eloquent dissertation, Dr. Wu, I would just like to comment first by saying I find it perhaps to be a little bit naive, as Dr. Drake responded, that human nature may not always enable the facilitation of your proposed democratic system. But what is missing from this proposed new system, from my perception, is an underlying framework on which to base policies and base laws, and on which to have society's various mechanisms guide themselves. In other words, a constitution, written or unwritten, as in the British system, a system of common laws, or both a constitution, as we have here in Canada, or a system of a constitution and common law, on which to base the policy setters. You spoke of having the public enabled to set policy by way of votes. Well, if public can set policy in an unbridled fashion, that leads all too often to the most greedy, the most egotistical having their way in setting policies. We only have to look south to Washington State to see a microcosm of this. A gentleman named Tim Henman puts to referenda all the time for voters in Washington State to have the right to have taxes raised. And consistently for several years, there have been votes by the public in Washington State defeating the wish of the legislature to raise taxes for important social and health projects, which has created great impasses in their legislature. China would benefit, I submit, from having the ability to reference common law across the British Commonwealth on which to base its own policy setting. China would benefit as well in having a constitution which speaks specifically to the rights and obligations of various parts of society, such as we have here in Canada. Perhaps at that time, a non-confrontational model of democracy such as what you're proposing, Dr. Wu, would be more facilitatable. But I must suggest very strongly that there needs to be a focused and concerted attempt at developing an underwritten constitution so that you don't have democracy without parameters. There must be parameters in democracy, or we get Hitlers, we get Mussolinis. Thank you very much. If you have any response, I'd be happy to hear your response to the need for a constitution and or basing laws and policy setting on common law. And common law, for those of us here who don't know, common law is precedent setting in the courts. And I just would like to leave it at that, I guess.
The next question comes from Dr. David Fong.
Thank you again for the presentation. I think that Dr. Wu is embarking on a very important subject about different form of democracy, especially for developing countries. From the Western country perspective, I think over the years of development, we have seen the life improving from the Industrial Revolution to today. So despite whatever concerns we have, we must say that if our lives are improving for the majority of the people, the system is working. It will never be perfect, and we can always look for something better. But for a country like China, with its huge population, if we think we've got problems with 30 million people, to have 1.3 billion people trying to be heard, it will be a major challenge. But I would like to, so I think Dr. Wu's effort and direction is correct. But I think I would submit that Professor Drake's comments are extremely appropriate in many instances. And I would just I'd like to add a couple of comments on those elements. First, I think being Chinese, we've always also been educated in Chinese culture. But we must remember that despite the pride of the Chinese culture has a history of respect for the elite. And that has been for thousands of years because the masses are ignorant. And that was the basis of Confucianism, is that people need to comply to the rulers. Okay. Communism has changed that. I think despite all the problems with communism that we have, communism, through education, has now changed the fact that more and more people are no longer ignorant. More and more people are no longer starving. The idea of complying only to the elites is slowly fading away. Today, I think the government in Beijing is worrying because they are starting to worry about the legitimacy to rule. And that came about because of the Communist Party. If we talk about Africa, the issue is not the form of government, it's that they need the good fortune of finding a benevolent dictator who would get the population to become educated. The right of the individual is the guarantee for democracy. So despite the fact our concern about demonstrations in south of the border, it's just a different form that Americans like to express the individual's guarantee for democracy. In Canada, we feel that we are more civilized than the Americans, but we too want to have our say. So I would just like to say to Dr. Wu, please continue your search for models. I think maybe the model that you propose may not be perfect, but I think for a country like China, for countries in Southeast Asia, we have seen successes in Korea. Again, through a benevolent dictatorship, people become educated, democracy start to take rule. Taiwan is very much the same way. Singapore is very much the same way. How China will emerge, I think, would be through more efforts like yourself and your institutes. How Africa will emerge, I think Africa is so far behind. I think a model for democracy is really out of the question. They need a benevolent dictator before they can even talk about having a model for democracy. Thank you.
Okay. The gentleman at the back.
Yes, I just have a small question for Dr. Drake. In your closing, you make comment that while critiquing Dr. Wu's thesis, that you sort of comment that perhaps it is suitable for a society if if the politicians as well as the electorates are not so I think you use the term is self-censure. Self-censure. Now, it leads me to raise a question. Are you suggesting that even in our very developed Western North American societies, with all the political institutions in place, with all the high level of education, that we still have not evolved from being selfish, so that we need to have the kind of a very legalistic institutions to keep everyone in place? That's my question.
Well, yes, I'm afraid I am suggesting that most people in our society, although we certainly have a higher level of education and a higher level of income and more broadly spread than ever before in history, we still have not reached the stage that either Mr. Wu or Socrates and Plato were looking for, that we've all become absolutely unselfish patriots. I don't see that. Yes, there are some individuals who are that way, but I think most of us are still animated by selfishness, by wanting to get ahead, by wanting to maximize happiness, power, wealth. That's what animates a society, and particularly a society like ours, which is based on the market system, where the way ahead is to compete and to do the best. Everybody's trying to compete, thinking they have a better system, a better product than anybody else. We're not at a state yet where we can say the only thing that animates us is the good of all society. Maybe some monks in religious institutions who only think good are that way, but most of us are not that pure. I wish it were true. Therefore, I think the starting point from all of this has to be an assessment of human nature and the capacity of human nature, and you have to build institutions which build on your idea of human nature and how you can get the best out of them. But there have to be some restraints. There have to be restraints to protect the poor in society, the disenfranchised in society. And that, I guess, is maybe where Edward and I differ. I think he has a much more optimistic view of human nature than I do. Maybe being surrounded by Chinese, you have more pure thoughts. But we Anglo-Saxons are not so pure.
Yeah, sure.
But Dr. Gray, I'm reminded of Dr. Samuel Johnson's famous saying that the test of a democratic society is in its treatment of the less fortunate in this society. If that's the case, then we really do not have a democratic society in Canada, nor in any other Western societies. So in the case, are you really defeating your own argument, your own critique of Dr. Wu's because you really are not striving for the kind of society, the kind of democracy that Dr. Wu's, no matter, irrespective of its naivety and idealism, but nevertheless is addressing that age-old, as you talk about, the Plato, and all other philosophers, both East and West.
I would like to add a word to what I've already said on the system of government. I believe in one thing. I believe in the survival of the fittest. I believe that the fittest system will survive. So for 5,000 years, absolute monarchy was the most suitable system. That was the system at the time. Today, that is ruled out. Today, we have multi-party election. Multi-party election had a history of something like 300 years. Now, if we look at the political system, 300 years is not a long time. I think we have to cast our imagination into the future. What would the world be like 500 years from today? Would the world be involved with all sorts of multi-party election? I wonder how it would be like. And I can only make some proposal, but I cannot say how it is likely to be. Thank you very much.
Mr. Peter Ng.
I have a question for Edward Wu. Like Professor Drake, I have not come to this occasion completely unbiased. I have read Mr. Wu's book, and I have known Mr. Wu, I think, personally, longer than any of you here, maybe with the exception of 2 or 3 people. Maybe. But I was very refreshed with what I have heard. I have discussed his thesis with Mr. Wu quite a few times in the past, and it is most refreshing to hear this dialogue in this Center for Dialogue. But I do not think Mr. Wu is naive, is so naive as to think that his paper will help to solve the problems of the political problems of half the world. I think his point was to sort of introduce new angles to the concept of democracy, particularly at a time when we all are working under the understanding that Western-style democracy, including the multi-party elections, is the answer for the political problems of society. So it is, I think, that is the purpose of his thesis. But in answer to Professor Drake's point, I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit from Mr. Wu about his thinking about the case of China in relation to his thesis. Maybe we don't have too much time, but maybe just to give us some hope that it might be useful in a Chinese context.
As we all know, there's no election system in China. But about the time when the Soviet Union disintegrated, people started to think that China would soon follow. I held a different view, and I have my reason for it. In 1978, a very important decision was made. At the time, it was decided that the two whatever policies should be abandoned. And the two whatevers means whatever the party says must be correct. Whatever Chairman Mao said must be correct. And that was known as the two whatever policies had to be abandoned. In its place, there was the decision that the only way to find out the truth was through pragmatic experience. To me, that was a watershed decision, very, very important. And that explained why China is what it is today. If experience tells us that it was not good to have a planned economy, we just abandon it. And if experience says that you cannot prohibit private ownership, we just abandon it. We just change it. With this decision, I think the Chinese government has become a government which will adopt to changes according to the need. Now that is the situation. So I am not that worried as many people do about the Chinese system. If it is not good, they will change it. That's the way I feel it. I'm not suggesting that it is presently perfect. But all that I can say is, if this examination of to ascertain the truth is only from a pragmatic experience, if this same policy is followed in the years ahead, I think we have nothing to worry about. Thank you.
We have time for one short question from Majid.
Thank you for this opportunity. I really admire your thoughts, and I think it's very good to challenge this multi-party election system, which I personally disagree with. But I'm afraid also I should agree with Dr. Drake on certain issues that he raised, and I very much would like to hear your answer to his point about what's the role of the other political parties in your model, as well as what would stop the ruling party or the party in power to change the policies to stay a little bit longer.
As I have stated in my paper, I have only presented a broad outline of how things should be like. Now, the first round of election, let's say there may be quite a number of political parties, because the more immature a country is politically, the more parties there are for the election. For example, in Indonesia, the last election, I understand that there were as many as 46 political parties. When you have, the present MPE system is that you have the winner and you eliminate the rest. My system is that you have a quinella. In other words, if you are number one and number two, you get it. Now, having done that, we try to do something to make the two parties at par insofar as acceptability is concerned. There are many ways to do that. It is not possible to discuss these ways in detail. But as far as the other political parties is concerned, surely they do not represent the people. For example, if the first party has 43%, the other party has 40%, together they would make up more than 80%. So the other parties would only represent a small minority of the people. But of course, even though they are not represented, whatever they say has to be carefully considered. In other words, I am not trying to compromise on the democratic ideals in any way. I just want to provide a system to avoid conflict, so to speak. Thank you.
I'm Jan Walls with the David Lamb Center, and it's my pleasure to draw things to a conclusion today. First of all, I would like to express my thanks to Dr. Edward Wu for coming all the way over here from Kuala Lumpur, where he was just a couple of days ago, to share his thoughts with us, his courageous thoughts and his idealistic thoughts. They're both courageous and idealistic. As a result of his thoughts, he has brought. I just jotted down a note here, listening to Professor Drake just a few minutes ago, referring to the essential nature of humanity. And he's brought us right back to the raging issue of 2,400 years ago in China of whether 人之初性本善 or 人之初性本恶, whether human beings are fundamentally good, born fundamentally good, or whether they're born fundamentally evil. And your belief in one or the other of those is going to characterize the way you're going to envision the role of government. And having said that, I want to thank both Earl Drake and James Ho for taking the time and putting the efforts in to contribute to this dialogue. I'll just add my own 2 cents before I call this to a close, and that is, I think there's one point that might be raised that hasn't been raised yet, and that has to do with universally shared values, which I think must underlie a universally shared vision of political structure. And I think the one universally shared value that needs to be promoted much more energetically is that which we will call humanity. And I think that the vision of, in Chinese we call that 人道主义, right? Humanism. There's this whole school of thought called humanism. And if we say that humanism must underlie and therefore not be violated by anything above it, if it must underlie things like culture, language, religion, mythology, politics, all of which must be seen as regional manifestations or regional variations of something which is much more fundamental, and that is humanity and humanism, then we can talk about structuring political dynamics in such a way as to be consistent with the values of humanism. But we must be sure that humanism is recognized as being much more universal than any one of these others, culture, language, religion, politics, or whatever. I would like to offer a small gift of thanks to Dr. Wu for coming over here and sharing his thoughts with us. I've traveled enough myself to know that very lightweight and not too bulky gifts are much more appreciated than heavy gifts when you have to carry suitcases. This is, you'll find, if you want to get people's attention before your next presentation, you can play these. These are CD recordings of the Simon Fraser University Pipe and Drum Corps, the bagpipe team, which has won first place in world competitions several times, much to the chagrin of the Scottish teams. They've even won it in Edinburgh, in Scotland. We'd like to leave you with this small gift. And I'll give this to you first. And to remind people that we do have, if your interest has been inspired in this subject, we have the book that has been referred to. We have copies of that book in the SFU bookstore. In fact, we have some of them on a little stand over here. If you're interested in them, I'm sure you could convince the author to autograph the book for you, and to welcome you to chat with our participants and have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea if you haven't found that already. We have a reception for a little while in the hallway outside. Thank you very much for coming and taking part in our dialogue.